He carried a cardboard box out of the building where he had given 11 years of his life, and the only person waiting for him at the gate was his 7-year-old daughter. She was sitting on the curb eating a granola bar, backpack still on, homework folder tucked under her arm. She looked up at him the way kids do when they already know something is wrong but haven't decided how to react yet. "Daddy," she said, "why do you have your desk stuff?" Ethan Holloway set the box down on the sidewalk. He crouched beside her, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. He had just been publicly humiliated in front of a boardroom full of people. He had just been called irrelevant by a 30-year-old CEO who had never once set foot on a factory floor. He had just lost the job that paid the mortgage, covered the school fees, and kept the lights on in the small house where his daughter slept every night beneath a photograph of her mother. But he looked at that little girl and he said, "We're going to be okay." He did not know yet whether that was true. If this story sounds like someone you know, or someone you've been, stay until the end. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Delmark manufacturing plant had been operating in Harlow Creek for over 4 decades, and in all that time it had never once looked like it was going to make it. That was the honest truth, and most people who worked there knew it. The equipment was old. The ownership had changed hands twice in 15 years. The profit margins ran thin enough that any bad quarter could have been the last one. But somehow, the place kept going. Part of the reason it kept going was the people. The machinists who'd been there 20 years and knew every sound each press and lathe was supposed to make. The maintenance crew that could coax a broken conveyor back to life with nothing but experience and a flashlight. The floor supervisors who knew which orders needed to ship first and which customers would wait an extra day without complaint. And part of the reason it kept going was Ethan Holloway. He had started at Delmark at 21 as a junior maintenance tech, fresh out of a vocational program and carrying about $40 in his checking account. He had no connections in the industry, no family legacy, no angle. He just showed up early, worked past his shift when things needed doing, and paid attention in a way that most people around him didn't bother to. By 26, he was running a full maintenance team. By 29, he was head of operations. By 32, he was the person the company quietly depended on to keep the whole aging structure from caving in, though nobody in the front office ever said that out loud. His official title was Operations Director. His actual job was harder to explain. He was the one the floor supervisors called at midnight when a hydraulic press seized up and a shipment was due at 6 in the morning. He was the one who walked new hires through the machinery and told them not just how to run it, but why it worked the way it did. Because understanding the why kept people from making dangerous mistakes. He was the one who had spent the better part of 2 years quietly documenting every system in the plant, maintenance schedules, load tolerances, part replacement timelines, because he had a theory that the company's real problem wasn't the machines or the employees. The real problem was that nobody had ever taken the time to understand what they actually had. Outside work, his life was simpler and harder at the same time. His wife, Claire, had died of an aggressive cancer when their daughter, Nora, was 3 years old. It had been fast and brutal, and had left him with very little time to process anything before he found himself alone in a small house in Harlow Creek with a toddler and a grief he didn't know what to do with. He had no nearby family. His mother was 3 states away and couldn't travel easily. His in-laws had helped where they could for the first year, but they had their own lives and their own grief, and eventually he and Nora had settled into a rhythm that was just the two of them. She was 7 now. She went to Harlow Creek Elementary, where she was apparently something of a force of nature. Her teacher had sent home a note at the start of the school year that said, and Ethan had kept it on the refrigerator, "Nora is wonderfully confident, and I encourage her to channel that energy into collaborative rather than solo projects." He had laughed for the first time in weeks when he read it. She rode her bike on the sidewalk in front of their house after school, while he sat on the porch steps with whatever paperwork he'd brought home. She asked him questions constantly. Why the sky looked different colors at different times of day, whether fish got cold, what happened to old buildings when nobody used them anymore. He answered every question he could and told her when he didn't know so they could look it up together. She was the reason he got up in the morning. She was also, quietly, the reason he had started taking the company's problems home with him the way he did. Because he believed in what the plant could still become. And part of that belief was about securing something solid and lasting for their future in this town where they had put down roots. He was thinking about that, about roots, about the future, about the presentation he'd spent 3 weeks preparing. When he walked into the executive conference room on the third floor of the Delmark Administrative Building at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. The room was already full. The company's board of directors occupied one side of the long table. 6 people ranging from comfortable middle age to outright elderly, most of them investors who rarely showed up to these meetings unless something significant was happening. On the other side sat the senior management team. Department heads, the CFO, the VP of sales, people Ethan had worked alongside for years. And at the head of the table sat Victoria Ashford. She had been brought in 6 weeks ago as the new CEO, and in those 6 weeks she had made an impression. She was 30 years old, which was notable, but not the thing people talked about most. What they talked about was the way she moved through a room like she'd already made every decision and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. She had an MBA from a school with a name that opened doors, a track record of 3 successful turnarounds at tech-adjacent companies, and a certainty about herself that Ethan had found either impressive or alarming depending on the day. She had very little manufacturing experience. She had made it clear, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that she considered this a detail rather than a disqualifier. She was wearing a dark blazer and looking at her laptop when Ethan came in. She glanced up, clocked him, and returned to her screen without acknowledging him directly. Ethan found a seat near the middle of the table, set down his folder, and waited. The meeting opened with the CFO presenting the quarterly numbers, which were bad in the way they had been bad for 2 years. Not catastrophically, but steadily, like a tire going slowly flat. Revenue was down, operating costs were up. 2 major clients had moved production overseas. The company's debt service ratio was drifting toward territory that made lenders nervous. Everyone in the room had heard some version of this before. Ethan watched the faces around the table. Nobody looked surprised. Several people looked tired. Then Victoria stood up. "I want to walk you through the plan," she said. Her voice was even and assured. "What I'm about to present isn't a patch job. It's a structural solution." She pulled up a slide deck on the wall-mounted screen. Clean, professional, well-designed. The kind of presentation that communicated competence before you had even read the content. The plan was this. Delmark would exit the manufacturing business entirely. The plant would be shut down. The production equipment, most of which, she noted, was over 15 years old, would be sold for scrap or liquidated at auction. The company would pivot to a consulting and procurement model, helping clients source manufactured goods from lower-cost suppliers in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, taking a margin on volume rather than producing anything itself. The workforce, approximately 340 people on the floor, plus another 60-odd in support and administrative roles, would be let go in a phased reduction over 90 days, with severance packages aligned with contractual minimums. She walked through the numbers with precision. The cost savings in year 1 were significant. The projected margin on the consulting model, if client acquisition went according to her assumptions, was considerably better than the current manufacturing margins. She talked about lean operations, digital transformation, capital efficiency. She talked for 22 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she looked around the room. Questions? There was a pause. One of the older board members asked about the client transition plan. Another asked about potential liability from the workforce reduction. Victoria answered both questions with what Ethan recognized as thorough but incomplete responses, correct as far as they went, but carefully framed to not invite follow-up. He had been sitting very still. He had known, in a general way, that something like this was coming. There had been signals, the way Victoria had toured the plant floor in her first week and asked almost no questions about what was being made or how, only about headcount and equipment book value. The way she had shut down a conversation about capital reinvestment by asking what the ROI timeline was and then not waiting for the full answer. The way her conversations with the CFO had been happening behind closed doors in a way they hadn't before. But seeing it laid out in a slide deck, seeing 340 people reduced to a line item under phased workforce reduction, made something tighten in his chest. He raised his hand. Victoria looked at him. "Ethan, I'd like to present an alternative." The room shifted slightly, not dramatically. No one gasped or sat up straight. but there was a quality of attention that changed in the way it does when something unexpected happens. Victoria's expression didn't change. We're presenting a plan, not conducting a debate. I understand that, Ethan said. I'm not here to debate. I have a full proposal. I've had it ready for 2 weeks. I asked your assistant to put it on the agenda and was told you'd consider adding it. I reviewed the summary you submitted, Victoria said. It wasn't compelling enough to merit the full agenda time. There it was. He had sent a 4-page executive summary with supporting data. She hadn't even told him she'd read it. 5 minutes, he said. If it doesn't hold up, I'll sit down. One of the board members, Gerald Fitch, who had been with the company longer than almost anyone in the room, looked at Victoria and said, "Let him speak." It was quiet, the way requests from old men who hold significant equity tend to be quiet. Victoria looked at Gerald for a moment, then back at Ethan. The look she gave him was the kind that says this is a waste of everyone's time without saying it in words. 5 minutes, she said. Ethan opened his folder. He had been working on the proposal for most of a year. It had started as something he did in the evenings after Nora was in bed, a question he kept turning over in his head while the numbers at work got worse and worse. The question was simple. What does this company actually know how to do that nobody else does? The answer, when he finally articulated it clearly, was not mass production. They had never been competitive at mass production. The equipment was too old, the labor costs too high, the geography too inconvenient. They had been trying to compete on volume for 20 years and losing ground the entire time. But there was something else in the plant's history, buried in old client files and the memories of veteran machinists. Delmark had, at various points over its history, produced components so precise and so specialized that the clients who needed them had nowhere else to go. Hydraulic assemblies for prototype industrial equipment, custom tooling for small-batch aerospace subcontractors, medical device housings made to tolerances that ruled out cheaper alternatives. This work had always been treated as supplemental, filler business for when the main production lines were slow. Nobody had ever asked whether it could be the core. Ethan had spent a year asking. He had talked to former clients. He had researched the specialty manufacturing market. He had dug into the plant's equipment inventory and found, buried under years of deferred maintenance, machines that were old but still functional, and in several cases capable of precision work that newer mass production equipment couldn't match. The old Heidenhain-equipped vertical machining center that everyone complained about for its age was, according to 2 machinists who'd worked with it for 15 years, capable of tolerances that competing plants couldn't reliably hit. He had run the numbers 6 different ways. The margins on specialty work were not just better than mass production, they were dramatically better. The clients were stickier because switching to a new supplier meant requalifying every component. The workforce requirements were different, fewer people, but more skilled, which meant the veterans who knew the machines best became an asset rather than a cost problem. He had found 4 companies actively looking for a domestic specialty manufacturer who could handle their volumes. He had had preliminary conversations with 2 of them without representing himself as anything other than an interested party. Both had expressed serious interest. He laid all of this out in 5 minutes. He didn't rush, but he didn't waste a word. He talked about the market gap, the specific capabilities of the existing equipment, the preliminary client interest, the margin projections, the workforce model. When he finished, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Gerald Fitch was leaning forward slightly. Then Victoria spoke. "That was a creative presentation," she said. Her tone had not changed. "Unfortunately, it's based on some fundamental misunderstandings of how capital markets evaluate manufacturing assets, what specialty clients actually require in terms of certifications and infrastructure, and the realistic timeline for pivoting an operation of this size into a viable niche model. The numbers you're citing for specialty margins assume client acquisition that you have no demonstrated ability to execute." She paused. "You're an operations manager. You fix machines. I appreciate the initiative, but this is not your area of expertise." Ethan said, "2 of the clients in my projection have already indicated interest in a conversation," Victoria said. "Not a contract. There's a difference." She looked around the table. "Are there other questions about the restructuring plan?" One of the other board members, not Gerald, said something about the consulting model. The conversation shifted. Ethan sat with his hands flat on the table and felt the blood in his ears. Actually, Gerald said, quietly but clearly, I'd like to hear more about the specialty manufacturing model, specifically the… Gerald. Victoria's voice was still even, but something in it had sharpened. I respect your institutional knowledge of this company. I also need you to trust that the analysis behind this plan is thorough, and that reopening the conversation every time a well-meaning employee presents a white paper is not how successful turnarounds work. She smiled at Gerald with the kind of smile that isn't warm. We can schedule a one-on-one to address your concerns. Gerald said nothing more. Victoria turned back to the room. Thank you, everyone. We'll have the formal documentation distributed by end of week. Implementation timeline begins Monday. She looked at Ethan. Ethan, can you stay for a moment after? The others filed out. Gerald caught Ethan's eye on the way past and gave him a look he couldn't fully read, something between apology and I tried. Then it was just Ethan and Victoria in the conference room. She was closing her laptop. She didn't look at him right away. I'm going to be straightforward with you, she said, because I think you deserve that. Okay, he said. The proposal you put together shows real dedication. I mean that. You clearly put a lot of time into it. She paused. But we can't have operations people presenting alternative strategic plans during board meetings. It undermines the restructuring process. It signals to investors that leadership isn't unified, and frankly, it's not your role. My role, Ethan said, is to keep this plant running, which I've done for 11 years. Your role, Victoria said, was defined before I came on board. There was a beat of silence. I'm going to have to let you go, she said. Effective today. You'll receive the standard severance package. She finally looked at him directly. I want you to understand this isn't personal. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. 400 people work in this building, he said. I know most of them by name. A lot of them have been here longer than either of us. You're telling me their jobs are ending and it's not personal? I'm talking about your termination specifically. I know what you're talking about. She held his gaze. Security will escort you out after you collect your personal items. HR will be in touch about your paperwork. She gathered her materials. I genuinely wish you well. She walked out of the conference room. Ethan sat there for a moment, alone, in the room where he had just watched the future of 400 people get organized into a slide deck. Then he stood up and went to clean out his desk. There was not much to put in the box. That was the thing about having spent 11 years in a place. You'd think there would be more, but Ethan had never been a person who decorated his workspace heavily. A photograph of Nora at 5 sitting on his shoulders at the county fair. A dog-eared copy of a machinist's handbook he'd had since vocational school. A pocket-sized notebook he used for quick calculations. A coffee mug he'd gotten from a vendor that said, "Precision matters," in letters that had faded over years of washing. His computer access was already revoked by the time he sat down at his desk. Someone from IT appeared within 10 minutes to collect his badge and keycard. Several people stopped by while he packed. Most of them looked stricken in the way that people look when something bad is happening and there's nothing useful to say. Tommy Ferris, who ran the second shift floor crew and had worked under Ethan for 6 years, stood in the doorway and said, "This is wrong." And Ethan said, "Yeah." And that was the whole conversation. Marcus Webb, one of the senior machinists, stopped and gripped Ethan's shoulder without speaking, then walked away without turning back. The security escort was a young guy named Derek, who'd been with the company about 2 years and clearly felt terrible about the whole thing. He offered twice to carry the box. Ethan said he had it. They went down in the elevator together and through the lobby. Ethan had walked through this lobby thousands of times, so many that he stopped registering it years ago, but he registered it now. The old safety bulletin board near the entrance, where someone had pinned a birthday card for a woman in accounting, alongside a reminder about fire drill procedures. The scuffed floor that he had submitted a maintenance request to refinish 3 times without result. The front door with the sticker on the glass that said Delmark Manufacturing, Essent, 1981 in letters that had started to peel at the corners. He pushed through the door and walked out. It was a cool morning, overcast, with a smell in the air like rain coming later. The parking lot stretched out in front of him, mostly empty at this hour. Past the lot, the access road, and past that the fence line of the property, where Nora was sitting on the curb at the gate. He had forgotten she had a half day today. He had completely forgotten, and she had clearly tried calling him, but his phone was on vibrate in his jacket pocket and he hadn't felt it. And so she had sat down on the curb with her backpack on and her homework folder and was eating a granola bar she must have had in her bag, watching the gate with the patience of a child who has learned to wait. Ethan's throat closed. He walked toward her, and she looked up and saw the box, and he saw her processing it. The box, the security escort, the fact that he was leaving in the middle of a Tuesday morning. "Daddy," she said, "why do you have your desk stuff?" He set the box down. He crouched beside her until he was at her level, and the granola bar crinkled in her hand, and the morning air smelled like rain. "Something happened at work," he said. "I lost my job today." She looked at him with those serious eyes she'd gotten from her mother. "Are we going to be okay?" 11 years, 400 people, 3 weeks of work on a proposal that got called a white paper and dismissed in 2 sentences. His daughter sitting on a curb because he had forgotten her school schedule, because he had been too focused on trying to save something that had just been taken from him anyway. "Yes," he said. "We're going to be okay." He did not know yet whether it was true, but he meant it the way you mean things when you have no other option, not as a promise about the future, but as a decision about who you're going to be right now. He picked up the box. He took Nora's hand in his free hand. They walked to his truck together. The next 2 weeks were the particular kind of awful that doesn't announce itself dramatically. There was no breakdown. There were no sleepless nights spiraling into despair. What there was instead was the grinding, ordinary weight of logistics. Unemployment paperwork, updating a resume he hadn't touched in 5 years, going through the household finances with the kind of attention he'd been putting off, and finding that the margin between what he had and what he needed was thinner than he'd let himself acknowledge. The mortgage on the house was manageable for about 4 months on savings. After that, it wasn't. He called about jobs. He put in applications. 2 companies responded quickly with interest, both of them plants in cities 45 minutes away or more. He scheduled the calls, answered the questions, and found himself sitting across from a man at one of them, a regional operations VP, who spent most of the interview looking at his resume with an expression that suggested Ethan's 11 years at a small, struggling manufacturer in Harlow Creek was not the career trajectory he was looking for. "You've been at one place a long time," the man said. "Yes," Ethan said. "Why is that?" Ethan thought about the question. He thought about the real answer, that he had believed in what the place could become, that he had felt responsible for the people there, that he had stayed because leaving felt like abandonment, and he had already lost too much to something outside his control to walk away from something else by choice. He gave a shorter answer. The interview ended cordially, and he did not hear back. At night, after Nora was in bed, he found himself going back to the proposal, not to mourn it, or not only to mourn it, but to look at the numbers again, to check his assumptions, to ask whether he had gotten something wrong. He hadn't. That was the thing. He went over it 4 times, and the math held up. The market gap was real. The preliminary client interest was real. The equipment capability was real. The proposal wasn't perfect. There were things he hadn't fully modeled, supply chain considerations he'd only gestured at, a workforce transition plan that needed more detail. But the core of it was sound. He kept coming back to one question. What would it take to actually do it himself? Not at Delmark. Delmark was going to follow Victoria's plan now, regardless of what anyone thought. But the opportunity he'd identified wasn't about Delmark specifically. It was about a gap in the market that existed independent of any one company. The companies who needed domestic specialty manufacturing weren't going to stop needing it just because Delmark stopped providing it. He started running different numbers, not as an exercise, as a plan. What he had, a small house worth more than it had been when he bought it, which meant equity he could borrow against. 11 years of savings, which was not a lot but was something. A network of people inside Delmark who trusted him and who were about to be out of work, and a specific, detailed, documented knowledge of which machines in that plant were capable of what, and what those capabilities were worth to the right clients. What he needed? A facility, equipment, operating capital, clients. The facility problem was where the thing started to take on a different shape. He had heard during his years at Delmark that the company owned a secondary production wing on the east end of the property, an older building, maybe a third the size of the main plant, that had been used for overflow manufacturing a decade ago and then gradually decommissioned as the company contracted. It had been sitting empty for 7 years. It was on Delmark's books as a depreciating asset, generating nothing. He reached out to a commercial real estate contact who knew the area and asked casually what something like that might sell for. The answer was less than he'd expected, significantly less. The building had problems, roof repairs needed, electrical systems that would need assessment, floor loading that hadn't been certified in years. Most buyers would see liability. Ethan saw a space that he knew, and where he understood the problems better than anyone looking at it from the outside would. He made a call to the Delmark CFO, not Victoria, the CFO, who was a man named Richard Cho, who had always struck Ethan as someone trying to do a competent job in a difficult situation. He asked if the secondary wing was being included in the restructuring liquidation. Richard said yes, it was expected to go to auction. Ethan asked if there was any mechanism by which an interested party could make a preemptive offer before auction. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would need to speak to the board and that Ethan should not take anything as implicit approval. 2 days later, Richard called back. The board was willing to entertain a direct offer if it was competitive. Victoria had not been part of the conversation. The secondary property was technically a separate asset from the main restructuring and fell under direct board authority. Ethan hired a lawyer that he paid with money he didn't entirely have, and they put an offer together. While that was in process, he started making calls. Tommy Ferris was the first one he called. Tommy was 43, had run second shift production for 6 years, and had a family in Harlow Creek and no particular desire to relocate. He picked up on the second ring. "I've been waiting to hear from you," Tommy said. "I have something I want to talk through," Ethan said. "When?" "Tonight, if you can." Tommy came over after dinner. Ethan put Nora to bed and they sat at the kitchen table with the proposal spread out between them and 2 cups of coffee going cold, and Ethan walked him through the idea. Tommy asked hard questions. He was not a man who got excited quickly. That had always been one of his better qualities. He asked about cash flow in the early months, about what happened if the first clients fell through, about the equity arrangement Ethan was proposing where early employees would receive ownership shares in lieu of full market rate salaries. Ethan didn't have all the answers. He said so directly. "I think this can work," he said. "I'm not going to tell you I know it will. I can show you the numbers, and you can tell me where you think I'm wrong." Tommy looked at the numbers for a long time. "Marcus," he said finally. "You talked to Marcus?" "Not yet. You're the first. Talk to Marcus. If Marcus is in, you'll get the others who matter." Marcus Webb had been a machinist for 22 years. He was 51 and had the hands to prove it, scarred in the specific way of a man who has worked around metal and machinery his whole adult life. He was respected on the floor in the way that some people are respected without having formal authority, the way that experience and competence and a consistent character build something over decades that no title can replicate. He also had a reputation for being direct to the point of abrasion. He had once told a VP of operations, not Ethan, that his plan for reorganizing the floor workflow was the stupidest thing he'd heard since someone suggested replacing the machinist certification requirement with an online module, and he had said it in exactly those words with no apparent concern for the consequences. Ethan had always liked him. He drove to Marcus's house on a Thursday evening and found him in his garage working on a motorcycle he'd been rebuilding in pieces for about 2 years. Marcus looked up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and said, "I figured you'd come by eventually." Ethan explained the plan. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the motorcycle. He looked at the shop rag in his hands. "You mortgaging the house?" he said. "Yes." "That's your daughter's house." "I know." "So you believe in this?" "I believe in the numbers, and I believe in the people I'm asking to be part of it," Ethan said. "I can't promise you a certain outcome. I can tell you that the market opportunity is real, and that I've looked at this from every angle I know how to look at it." Marcus nodded slowly. What do you need from me specifically? Your skill, your knowledge of the VMC and the older precision equipment, and frankly, your credibility with the floor crew, because you know they trust your judgment, and if you're in, others will be willing to look seriously. That's a lot to ask. I know. Marcus turned the shop rag over in his hands. What's the equity arrangement look like for someone at my level? Ethan told him. Marcus was quiet again. Then he said, Okay. Okay, you're considering it, or okay, you're in. Don't make me say it twice, Marcus said. The offer on the secondary wing was accepted. It took 3 more weeks of paperwork, negotiation, and one genuinely difficult conversation with the bank about the home equity line, during which the loan officer looked at Ethan across a desk with an expression of careful professional neutrality that communicated without stating it that this was not an investment she would personally recommend. Ethan signed the papers. The day he got the keys to the building, he drove there alone. It was a Saturday morning, gray again, which seemed to be the default setting of his life lately. He let himself in through the main access door and stood in the empty space. It was not pretty. The floor had grit on it from years of disuse. 2 of the fluorescent fixtures in the main bay were hanging at odd angles. The far wall had a water stain that told a story about the roof he was going to have to address. The whole place smelled like metal and old air. He stood in the middle of it and looked at the space. He thought about what Marcus had said. That's your daughter's house. He knew. He knew exactly what he was risking and what it would mean if this didn't work. He was not the kind of person who was able to not know things like that. But he also looked at this empty building and saw something that was harder to explain, not potential in the abstract, but something specific and detailed and real. He could see where the machines would go. He could see the workflow from intake to production to finishing. He could see the faces of the people he was going to call, their particular skills, the things each of them knew how to do that couldn't be replaced by someone cheaper or more conveniently located. He could see it. He took out his phone and called Tommy. I have the keys, he said. When do we start? Tommy said. Monday. He locked up. He drove home. Nora was awake when he got there, eating cereal at the kitchen table and reading a book she'd checked out from the school library about how bridges were built. She looked up when he came in. Did you get the building? He had told her, in the simple terms that worked for a 7-year-old, what he was trying to do. She had listened very seriously and then asked whether she could visit the factory. He had said yes. I got it, he said. She looked at him for a moment with those serious eyes. Good, she said, and went back to her book. He sat down across from her and poured himself a cup of coffee and watched his daughter read about bridges, and felt for the first time in 3 weeks something that was not yet hope, but was the direction hope comes from. He still didn't know if it was going to work, but he had a building and a team and a plan. He had numbers that held up and clients who had said they were interested and equipment that could be made to run again. He had lost his job and his savings and the comfortable certainty of a paycheck on the 1st and 15th of every month. What he had instead was a chance to build something that was actually his. He drank his coffee. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to clear. The first Monday started at 5:45 in the morning with a broken water pipe. Ethan had gotten there at 5:30 to do a walkthrough before anyone arrived, flashlight in hand, notebook open, going through the checklist he'd written over the weekend. He had made it approximately 30 feet into the building before he heard the sound, a low, persistent hiss coming from the utility corridor behind the east wall, and found a corroded section of supply line weeping rust-colored water onto a concrete floor that had probably not been properly inspected since before Nora was born. He stood there looking at it for a moment. Then he wrote it down and kept walking. Tommy showed up at 6, followed shortly by Marcus, and then by 3 other men Ethan had called over the previous 2 weeks. Dale Hutchins, who had run the precision boring operations at Delmark for 14 years, Ray Soto, a tool and die specialist in his late 40s who had 2 ex-wives and a genuinely encyclopedic knowledge of carbide tooling, and Phil Garrett, who was 57 years old, had been at Delmark since the plant was still running at full capacity, and who had told Ethan on the phone, with the flat certainty of someone who has run out of patience for nonsense, I'm not relocating and I'm not taking a job at some warehouse. Tell me what you need. 6 people total. 6 people who had walked away from the only certain income they had, accepted ownership stakes in something that had not yet made a dollar, and showed up to a cold building on a Monday morning to get started. They stood in the main bay while Ethan walked them through the space and the plan. He didn't give them a motivational speech. He showed them the floor plan he'd drawn, the equipment list, the maintenance priority sequence. He told them about the water pipe. He told them the roof assessment was scheduled for Thursday and that they should assume it would find something they didn't want to hear. He told them the first client call, with a medical equipment manufacturer out of the Northeast, who had been one of the 2 serious inquiries from his original proposal, was in 3 weeks, and that he needed to be able to show them a functioning space and a realistic production timeline by then. "Any questions about priorities?" he said. Ray raised his hand. "We have a coffee situation?" "There's a machine in the back office. I don't know if it works." "I'll get it working," Ray said. "That's my first priority." Marcus looked at him. "Your first priority is the VMC assessment." "My first priority is coffee, and then the VMC assessment." It was not a good start exactly, but it was a real one. The days that followed were long and difficult in the specific way that building something from scratch is difficult. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just relentless. The water pipe cost them 2 days and more money than Ethan had budgeted. The roof assessment found what they expected it to find and added a line item to the expense column that made Ethan sit with his hands flat on his kitchen table that evening, running numbers until almost midnight, recalculating margins and timelines, looking for room. There wasn't much room. The equipment situation was better than the infrastructure, which was the only reason the whole thing stayed viable in those early weeks. Marcus's assessment of the vertical machining center was thorough and largely positive. The machine was old but had been maintained with care by whoever had last used it, and its core precision capabilities were intact. With calibration work and some replacement parts that Marcus had already sourced, it would run. The other machines were a mixed picture. 2 of the older lathes needed significant work. One piece of grinding equipment turned out to have a cracked spindle housing that Marcus diagnosed by sound alone. He walked up to it, listened to it run for about 45 seconds, said, "That's cracked," and was correct. That one went on the repair list with a cost estimate that Ethan wrote down and then stared at for a while. Dale and Phil worked on the facility while Marcus and Ray focused on the equipment. Tommy handled coordination, moving between tasks with the same steady efficiency he'd brought to the factory floor at Delmark, absorbing information, identifying bottlenecks, not complaining about things that couldn't be changed. He had a quality Ethan had always valued, which was that he dealt with problems as they were, rather than as he wished they were. In the evenings, Ethan handled everything else: client outreach, financial tracking, the paperwork for business registration and liability insurance, which turned out to be more complicated and more expensive than he had planned for, a conversation with his lawyer about contract templates that he needed before any client work could formally begin. He was tired in a way that was different from how he'd been tired before. Working at Delmark had been exhausting but bounded. There was a point at which the workday ended and he could go home and be a father. Now the edges of everything had dissolved. He was checking email at 11:30 at night. He was waking up at 4 with a thought about equipment certification he needed to follow up on. He was mentally working through cash flow problems while watching Nora's soccer practice, standing on the sideline with a cup of coffee he didn't remember buying. She scored a goal in the 3rd week. It was a chaotic, scrambling kind of goal. She had stumbled slightly and hit the ball off her shin at an angle that somehow found the bottom corner of the net, and she threw both arms up like she had done it on purpose. He cheered so loud that the parents near him looked over. She found him after the game. Her shin guard was crooked and there was mud on her face, and she looked ecstatic. "Did you see?" she said. "I saw," he said. "Were you watching or were you thinking about work?" He looked at her. She was 7 years old and she saw him completely. "I was watching," he said, and it was true, because for that moment he had been. "I saw the whole thing." She studied him for a second the way she did when she was deciding whether to believe something. Then she decided yes and grabbed his hand, and they walked to the car. The client call happened on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week. The company was called Novamed Components, and their procurement director was a woman named Sandra Leith, who had a reputation, according to Ethan's research, for being extremely good at her job and not particularly patient with people who wasted her time. She had been sourcing precision-machined housings for surgical instrument assemblies from a supplier in Ohio who had recently announced they were moving production overseas, leaving Novamed scrambling. Ethan had the call in the back office, sitting at a folding table with his laptop and the documentation he'd assembled. Through the wall, he could hear the sound of Marcus running the VMC through a calibration sequence. Sandra Leith was direct from the first minute. She asked about certifications, which quality management standards they were operating under, whether they had medical device manufacturing experience, what their inspection capabilities were. Ethan answered honestly, including the parts that were not favorable. They did not yet have ISO 13485 certification, which was the relevant standard for medical device manufacturing. It was in process. The timeline for completing it was approximately 4 months. "That's a problem," Sandra said. "I know," Ethan said. "Our precision capabilities are real, and I can document them. The certification process is a matter of completing the audit, not of achieving what the audit measures. But I understand if you need a qualified supplier now." There was a pause. "Send me the capability documentation," Sandra said. "The tolerances, the equipment specs, the quality control process. I have a secondary component line that doesn't require 13485. It's not implantable. It's external instrument housing. The tolerances are tight, but not outside what you're describing." "I can have that to you by Thursday," Ethan said. "Do it by Wednesday," she said. "I have 3 other calls this week." He sent it by Wednesday morning. She responded by Thursday afternoon asking for sample production. 3 prototype housings to specified tolerances, delivered within 2 weeks. He went out to the floor and found Marcus. "Novamed wants prototypes," he said. 2-week turnaround. Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the specifications Ethan handed him. He read them with the particular focused expression of a man doing rapid mental calculations he doesn't feel the need to narrate. "Doable," he said. "Dale needs to be on the fixturing." "Done." "We're going to need material. I'll give you a list." "Give it to me now." Marcus gave it to him from memory. They ran the prototypes in 11 days. Marcus did the final pass on each one personally, checking dimensions with a level of care that Ethan recognized as not just professional competence, but something closer to pride. The particular investment of a craftsman who has spent decades developing a skill and does not enjoy the thought of putting his name on something that isn't right. The first housing came off the machine and Marcus measured it 3 times before handing it to Dale for secondary inspection. Dale measured it twice. They looked at each other. .002 under on the bore diameter, Dale said. Marcus looked at the setup sheet. He made an adjustment. They ran another. "There it is," Dale said. They packaged the 3 prototypes and shipped them. Then they waited. Sandra Leith called back 5 days later. Ethan took the call outside, standing in the gravel lot beside the building because the cellular signal was better there. "The tolerances are within spec," she said. "The surface finish on the internal bore is actually better than what we were getting from our previous supplier." "That's Marcus Webb," Ethan said. "He's been running VMC operations for over 2 decades. "I'd like to place an initial order," Sandra said. 40 units. If they match the prototypes, we'll talk about a longer-term arrangement." Ethan wrote the number 40 on his palm with a pen he had in his jacket pocket, because he was not going to say anything out loud until he had processed it. "We can do that," he said. When he hung up, he went back inside and found Marcus at his machine. 40 units, he said. Marcus nodded once, the way he had nodded in his garage when he agreed to join. The same economy. "Timeline? She needs them in 3 weeks. Then we start Monday." Ethan turned to go. Marcus spoke again without looking up from his machine. "You should tell the others." He gathered them in the main bay that evening. Tommy and Dale and Ray and Phil, still in their work clothes, smelling like coolant and metal, standing in the space they had spent the last month cleaning and repairing and arguing over and worrying about. He told them about the order. Ray said, 40 units, what's the revenue on that?" Ethan told him. There was a moment of quiet. Then Phil, who had not said anything particularly optimistic in the entire month they'd been working together, said, "That'll cover the roof repair." "Most of it," Ethan said. Phil looked around the space. "All right then." That was the whole celebration. It was enough. The Novamed order shipped on time. All 40 units measured within spec. Sandra Leith's follow-up message was 4 sentences. She confirmed receipt, confirmed inspection results, and said she would be sending terms for a quarterly supply agreement. The 4th sentence said, "You run a tight operation." Ethan read it standing at the folding table in the back office and didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Then he forwarded it to Tommy and went back to work. The second client came through differently. Not from Ethan's original proposal list, but from a phone call he had not expected. A man named Jim Caulfield, who ran procurement for a small rescue equipment manufacturer, had gotten Ethan's number from someone in his industry network who had apparently heard, through the kind of lateral transmission that moves through niche industries without anyone orchestrating it, that there was a specialty shop in Harlow Creek that could do precision work on short runs. Jim Caulfield needed 200 mounting brackets machined to aerospace-adjacent tolerances for a line of technical rescue anchoring equipment. His usual supplier had a 6-week backlog. He needed them in 4. 4 weeks is tight, Ethan said on the phone, doing the calculation in his head while simultaneously tracking what Marcus was currently running and what Dale had staged for the week. "I know it's tight," Jim said. "That's why I'm calling you instead of waiting for my usual guy. Let me look at our current load and call you back in 2 hours." He called back in 90 minutes. "We can do it." They did it in 3.5 weeks. Jim Caulfield called the day after the shipment arrived and said, "I'm going to give you the rest of the year's order." Then he said, "Who taught your machinist to hold tolerances like that on a run this size?" 22 years, Ethan said. Nobody taught him. He just paid attention. The money from these 2 orders was not enough to declare anything a success. They were still operating on thin margins, still several months away from anything resembling stability, still carrying the weight of the equipment loans and the building costs and the salaries Ethan was paying himself and his team. Ray's partial equity arrangement meant he was drawing less than half what he'd made at Delmark, and he had made a point of mentioning this approximately once a week, always accompanied by a dark joke that was half serious. "I have 2 kids in the house and a truck payment," Ray said one afternoon while they were cleaning the floor at the end of a long shift. "I just want to say that for the record." "It's on record," Ethan said. "I'm not complaining." "You are complaining." "I'm registering a concern," Ray said. "There's a difference." "The Novamed agreement pays out in 30 days, Ethan said. "When it does, I'm adjusting your draw." Ray was quiet for a moment. "By how much?" Ethan told him. Ray swept for another few strokes. "Okay," he said. "That's okay." It wasn't comfortable. Nobody pretended it was comfortable. But there was a quality in the building that had started to develop over those months. Something that wasn't morale exactly, because morale implied a certain lightness. And there wasn't much lightness in an exhausted group of middle-aged tradespeople working long hours for less money than they deserved. It was more like coherence, a shared understanding of what they were doing and why, a trust built from the fact that everyone in the building was carrying the same weight and nobody was pretending otherwise. Ethan noticed it in the specific ways that trust shows up when it's real. Marcus and Dale solving a fixturing problem together without being asked, staying an extra hour because they wanted to get it right. Phil fixing a wiring issue in the back of the shop on a Saturday morning because he'd been thinking about it during the week. Tommy keeping a handwritten log of every client interaction and delivery date that turned out to be more useful than anything Ethan had set up in the software. One evening, a Thursday, late, nearly 8 o'clock, Ethan was at his table in the back office going through accounts when he heard someone come in through the side door. He looked up. It was Marcus. "Thought you left," Ethan said. "I did. Came back." Marcus pulled up a chair that didn't match the folding table and sat down heavily. He looked at the papers spread in front of Ethan without saying anything for a moment. "How bad is it?" Ethan looked at the numbers. "We're not going under," he said, "but the margin between operating and not operating is about 3 months right now. If we don't add at least one more significant client in the next 60 days, I'll need to renegotiate terms with the bank." "What does that look like?" "More expensive and less flexible." Marcus was quiet. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had been working with machines for a long time, calloused and scarred and capable. "You have prospects?" "2. One is further along. There's an engineering firm that does prototype tooling for industrial equipment manufacturers. They need a domestic source for low-volume precision parts. I have a call with them next week. What do you need from me for that call? Capability documentation. I need you to write down everything the VMC can do in plain language. No jargon, what it can make, what tolerances it holds consistently, what material ranges you can run. 2 pages. I've never written anything like that. Write it like you're explaining it to someone who doesn't work in manufacturing but has to make a purchasing decision. Marcus made a face that suggested this was not how he would naturally prefer to communicate. I'll try. That's all I need. Marcus stood up. He looked at Ethan for a moment, a straight, direct look that didn't carry sentiment, but didn't withhold it either. You know what the difference is between this place and Delmark? He said. Ethan waited. At Delmark, nobody knew what we were building, not really. They said manufacturing, but they meant something they could sell to someone who'd sell it to someone else. Marcus picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Here, we know. Every order we ship, we know why we made it and who needs it. He shrugged, a short, economical gesture. Makes it easier to care. He left. Ethan sat in the quiet of the back office and looked at the numbers he'd been staring at for the last 2 hours, and felt the particular weight of a man who is responsible for other people's livelihoods and has chosen that responsibility deliberately and completely. He thought about the engineering firm call. He thought about the cash flow timeline. He thought about Ray's truck payment and Tommy's kids in school, and Phil, who was 57 years old and had put his retirement calculations into an equity stake in a company that had been operating for 4 months. Then he thought about what Marcus had said. He closed the ledger. He turned off the light in the back office. He drove home, let himself in quietly, and checked on Nora, who was asleep with her book open on her chest. Still the one about bridges, she'd been reading it for weeks. And he closed it carefully and put it on the nightstand and pulled the blanket up. He went to bed. He set his alarm for 5:15. In the morning, he would make the calls. The engineering firm call went long, 45 minutes instead of the 20 he'd scheduled, which was a good sign. The man on the other end, a mechanical engineer named Peter Haas, who ran procurement for a company called Trident Industrial, asked the kind of questions that meant he'd done research before picking up the phone. He wanted to understand not just the capabilities, but the process, how work moved through the shop, how quality was verified, what the escalation path was when something came back out of spec. Ethan answered everything straight. When he didn't have an answer, he said so and gave a timeline for when he would. Peter Haas said, I'm going to send you an NDA and a parts package. If your team can quote it, we'll go from there. The parts package came the next day. Marcus looked at it for 20 minutes and then said, This is going to be interesting, in a tone that could have meant several things. Good interesting or bad interesting? Ethan said. Both, Marcus said. The tolerances on the secondary bore profile are tighter than anything we've quoted before. We can hit it, but it's going to take longer per part than standard. What does that do to the margin? Depends on how we quote it. If you quote it at standard rates, we lose money. If you quote it at what it actually costs us, it might be more than they want to pay. Let me see the numbers. They worked through it together that afternoon, Marcus on the technical side, Ethan on the cost and margin side, building a quote that was honest about what the work required. It was not the cheapest number. Ethan looked at it for a while and thought about whether to reduce it. He didn't. He sent it to Peter Haas with a cover note that explained the reasoning behind the price, the tolerance requirements, the per-part setup time, the quality verification process. Not an apology for the number, an explanation. Peter Haas called back 2 days later. Your quote is about 18% above where I hope to be, he said. I know, Ethan said. The note explains why. I read the note. A pause. I also called Sandra Leith at Novamed because you listed them as a reference. Ethan hadn't listed them as a reference. He had mentioned them as a current client in the capability documentation. He absorbed this without comment. She said your team held tolerances she'd stopped expecting from domestic suppliers, Peter said. She also said you told her up front about the certification gap instead of letting her find out later. That was the right thing to do. It's also not common, Peter said. I'm going to approve the quote. I want a 10-part first run. If it performs, we'll talk about a master supply agreement. After the call ended, Ethan sat in the quiet of the back office for a moment. Then he went out to find Marcus. Trident approved the quote, he said. Marcus looked up from the machine he was setting up. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, the particular quality of a man who has been waiting to find out whether a thing he bet on was real. When do they want the first run? 6 weeks. Marcus turned back to his machine. Then we'd better get the setup right the first time. Outside, through the high windows of the main bay, the afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, catching the metal surfaces of the machines and the fine particulate of metal dust that hung in the air of any working shop. It was not a glamorous sight. It was not the kind of place that impressed anyone who walked in expecting something polished. But the machines were running. The work was real. The people doing it knew what they were building and why. That was not everything. Ethan knew that clearly, knew that 3 clients and a 4-month operating history and a cash position that still required careful daily management was nowhere near a finished story. There were things that could still go wrong and probably would. Equipment failures he hadn't planned for, clients who might pull back, loans that would come due before the revenue caught up. He had given everything he had to get to this point, and he was going to have to keep giving it. But standing in the shop on a Thursday afternoon with the machines running and the team at work, he felt something he recognized. Not satisfaction, which was too settled a word for where they were. More like traction. The feeling of wheels finally finding the road. He went back to his desk. There were emails to answer and a bank call to prepare for, and a parts list from Marcus that needed purchasing. He sat down and got to work. The Trident Industrial first run shipped on a Wednesday, all 10 parts within spec, and Peter Haas sent a 2-line email that said the inspection results had passed and he was forwarding the master supply agreement for review. Ethan read it at 6 in the morning, standing in his kitchen while the coffee brewed, still in the clothes he'd slept in because he'd fallen asleep at his desk again and hadn't made it to bed. He printed the agreement. He read every page. He called his lawyer, who made 2 small changes to the liability language, and sent it back signed by end of day. That was the moment, though he didn't mark it as such at the time. He was too tired and there was too much still to do. But looking back later, that was the moment the company stopped being an experiment and became a business. It did not transform overnight. That was not how things like this worked, and Ethan had never expected it to. What happened instead was incremental and uneven, and frequently interrupted by problems. A 3-week stretch where the VMC developed an intermittent positioning error that Marcus diagnosed, repaired, re-diagnosed, and repaired again before finally tracing it to a degraded servo drive that cost more to replace than they had budgeted. A client who pushed back on a delivery timeline in a way that required Tommy to spend 2 days managing the relationship while Ethan restructured the production schedule. A situation with Ray that came to a head on a Friday afternoon and required a conversation that neither of them particularly wanted to have. Ray had been offered a job. He told Ethan directly, which Ethan respected, came to him on a Friday, end of shift, when the others had gone, and stood in the doorway of the back office and said, "I need to tell you something." The job was at a larger plant 40 minutes away. Full salary, benefits, no equity risk. The number was considerably more than Ray was currently drawing. Ethan looked at him. "When do you need to decide?" "They gave me a week." "What do you want to do?" Ray leaned against the doorframe. He was a compact, restless man who expressed discomfort by going very still, which he was doing now. "I have 2 kids, Ethan. I have a truck payment and a mortgage, and my youngest starts needing braces next year." "I know. I'm not asking you to match it. I know you can't match it right now." "What are you asking?" Ray was quiet for a moment. "I'm asking if you think this is real. Not the company line, not the thing you'd say to keep me here. Actually real." Ethan thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. He thought about the Trident agreement and the Novamed quarterly order and the 3rd client he'd been in conversation with for the past 6 weeks. A precision engineering firm that supplied components to defense subcontractors, which was the kind of client that, if they came through, changed the company's profile in ways that mattered. He thought about the cash position, which was better than it had been at 4 months, but still required care. He thought about the roof repair that was finished, but the electrical upgrade that wasn't. He thought about the things that could still go wrong. "Yes," he said, I think it's real, but I can't promise you the timeline on when real turns into comfortable. That might be another year. It might be 18 months. Ray looked at the floor. A year is a long time when you have kids. I know that. I'm not saying no, Ray said. I'm saying I need to think about it. Think about it, Ethan said. I mean that. Don't make this decision based on loyalty. Make it based on what your family needs. Ray left without giving an answer. He came back Monday morning, put on his safety glasses, and went to work without mentioning it. On Wednesday, he called the other company and declined. He never told Ethan directly what he'd decided. Ethan found out because Tommy mentioned it casually, as though it wasn't particularly significant. Ethan didn't bring it up with Ray. Some things were better left between a man and his own thinking. The defense subcontractor client materialized in the 9th month. Their name was Arbor Precision Systems, and their procurement lead, a meticulous woman named Carol Vance, who had clearly spent years dealing with suppliers who overpromised, came to the shop in person before she agreed to anything. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, drove herself, parked in the gravel lot without comment, and walked through the facility with Ethan for 2 hours asking questions that were specific enough to be uncomfortable. She wanted to understand not just the machines, but the quality control process. She pulled random documentation from the wall-mounted binder system that Tommy had set up and read it. She asked Marcus, directly and without preamble, what his process was for detecting drift in a long production run. Marcus looked at her with the expression he reserved for questions he considered worth answering and said, "Interval checking every 15 parts, tighter if the material runs inconsistent. I keep a running log of the measurements. You want to see it?" "Yes," Carol said. He showed her the log. She read through 2 months of entries without speaking. "You do this on every run?" she said. "I do it on every run that matters," Marcus said, "which is all of them." She left without committing to anything. 3 days later, she sent an email asking for a formal quality management documentation package and a price sheet for specific part families. Ethan had the documentation package assembled within 48 hours, partly because he'd been building it for months in anticipation of exactly this kind of client, and partly because Tommy had developed a filing system so thorough that finding anything in it took less than 10 minutes. The proposal took longer. The part families Carol was asking about were complex, requiring certifications they had worked toward but not yet fully completed, and Ethan had a decision to make about how to present the gap. He could frame it optimistically, highlight the progress, minimize the timeline, or he could do what he'd done with Sandra Leith a year ago. He did what he'd done with Sandra Leith. The cover letter was direct. Here is what we can do. Here is what we are in the process of certifying. Here is the honest timeline. Here is why we believe the work quality justifies proceeding now, rather than waiting for us to check every box. He included the Novamed reference without being asked. He included the Trident reference. He sent it on a Friday. Carol called the following Tuesday. "I've been doing this a long time," she said without greeting. "Suppliers who tell me up front what they can't do are rarer than they should be." "It seemed like the right approach," Ethan said. "It is. I'm going to give you a conditional approval. 2 part families to start, low volume, with a quality audit scheduled at the 6-month mark. If the audit passes, we expand." "Understood." "One more thing," Carol said. "I talked to Sandra Leith and to Peter Haas. They both said the same thing about you." Ethan waited. "They said when something goes wrong, you call them before they have to call you." "That's the only way to operate," Ethan said. "More people should know that," Carol said, and hung up. By the end of the first year, the company, which Ethan had registered under the name Holloway Precision Works, a name he had chosen practically and without ceremony, had 3 active supply agreements, a 4th in negotiation, 7 employees including the original 6 plus a quality inspector named Diane, who had responded to a job posting and turned out to have a background in aerospace component inspection that was considerably beyond what the posting had described. He had hired her on the spot after a 40-minute interview, then called Tommy from the parking lot and said, "We got lucky." Tommy said, "We got lucky because you posted the job correctly and interviewed her properly. That's not luck. It's a little luck." "Fine. A little luck." The second year brought growth that felt less like progress and more like pressure from a different direction. More clients meant more capacity demands. More capacity demands meant equipment that was being run harder. Marcus had started keeping a separate log of machine hours with a line for projected maintenance intervals, and when Ethan saw it for the first time, he recognized what it was. A worry document, the kind that careful people make when they're tracking something they're afraid of. "How long do we have before the boring mill needs a rebuild?" Ethan asked. Marcus studied his log. "At current run rate, 12 to 14 months before we start seeing inconsistency. 18 before it becomes a production problem." "What does a rebuild cost?" Marcus told him. Ethan wrote the number down. "We'll plan for month 10, he said. "I want the work done before we're reacting to a failure. That's going to be tight timing with the Arbor audit in month 11. "I know, we'll sequence it carefully." This was how the days went. Not triumphant, not desperate. Just the steady management of real things, each decision cascading into the next. Each problem either solved or deferred based on priority and resource. Ethan had gotten better at the business side of things in ways he hadn't expected. He had started with a good understanding of operations and a reasonable grasp of finance, and the first year had taught him things that no proposal document had prepared him for. The difference between cash flow and profitability, the specific ways that client payment timing could create problems even when the business was technically healthy, the importance of never having only one version of any critical process living in one person's head. That last one had come from a hard lesson. Dale Hutchins had a family emergency in the second year. His father, a hospitalization, 2 weeks where Dale was largely unreachable. And during that time, it became clear that certain fixturing setups for the Novamed components existed primarily as institutional knowledge in Dale's memory. Marcus had covered it, and Diane had helped reconstruct what documentation existed, and they had not missed a delivery. But it had been close enough that Ethan sat the team down afterward and said, "We are documenting everything, starting this week, and I mean everything." Ray said, "Everything?" "Every setup, every process, every workaround. If Marcus is the only person who knows how to do something, that knowledge lives somewhere else too." Marcus looked like he had opinions about this. "Marcus," Ethan said. "I heard you," Marcus said. "I need you to actually do it, not just hear me." Marcus sighed in the way of a man who knows he has no good counterargument. "Fine." The documentation project took 3 months and produced a process manual that Ray described accurately as the most boring document he had ever held in his hands. They used it twice in the following year to cover for situations where someone was out. Both times, it worked. The news about Delmark started filtering through in the second year, arriving the way bad news about former employers tends to arrive. In fragments, through people who still had connections there, without anyone quite announcing it directly. Tommy heard it first, from someone he'd worked with on the floor. Victoria's restructuring plan had executed as scheduled. The plant had been shut down, the workforce let go, the consulting model launched. The first year's numbers had been, by the account of people who'd seen them, not catastrophically bad. Not good, but not catastrophic. The second year was different. The consulting model depended on client relationships that Delmark had built over decades as a manufacturer. Those relationships, it turned out, did not transfer cleanly to a procurement intermediary role. Clients who had trusted Delmark to make things didn't automatically trust Delmark to source things, especially when the sourced products came from overseas suppliers with whom the clients had no history. Quality complaints had started accumulating. 2 significant accounts had pulled their business. Victoria had brought in a consulting firm to assess the model. The assessment had reportedly cost more than anyone on the board had expected and produced recommendations that required additional capital investment. The board was not aligned on funding the investment. One of the larger investors had reduced his position. Tommy relayed all of this at a Friday evening debrief that had become a loose tradition in the company. Not a formal meeting, just the end of the week, people sitting in the main bay, sometimes with coffee, sometimes without, talking through what had happened and what was coming. "How bad is it over there?" Phil asked. "Bad enough," Tommy said. "Last I heard, they're burning through reserves faster than projected." Phil looked at Ethan. "You feel anything about that?" Ethan thought about the question honestly. It would have been easy to feel satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of someone who'd been publicly dismissed and was now watching the dismissal validated by events. He was human enough to have felt a version of it when he first heard. Something small and not particularly noble that he had noticed and then moved past. "I feel bad for the people who got laid off," he said. 300 of them were good people who did good work. What happened to them isn't better because the company that let them go is struggling. "What about Victoria?" Ray said. "I don't think about Victoria," Ethan said. It was mostly true. The conversation moved on. They talked about the upcoming Arbor audit, about a new piece of measurement equipment that Diane had made a case for purchasing, about a potential client in the medical robotics space that Ethan had been in preliminary conversation with. But after everyone else left, Tommy stayed behind, straightening up the folding chairs with the methodical habit of a man who doesn't like leaving a mess. "Delmark might go up for sale," Tommy said, without looking at Ethan. Ethan had been closing up his laptop. He stopped. "Where'd you hear that?" "Guy I know on the board side, not official, but there's conversations happening." Tommy stacked the last chair. "The secondary wing we're in was one of their assets. The main plant's bigger, better equipped, different scale." He looked up. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying." Ethan looked at the space around him. The machines running quiet at end of shift, the organized chaos of a working shop, the documentation binders Tommy had built, the quality log on the wall that Diane updated every morning. He didn't say anything that night. But the thought was there now, and it didn't leave. The Arbor audit happened in the 11th month of year 2, which meant the 14th month of operation overall. Carol Vance came with 2 of her quality engineers, and they spent a day and a half going through everything: process documentation, measurement equipment calibration records, non-conformance logs, corrective action histories. Ethan had been preparing for the audit for 4 months. He had gone through every document himself. He had run practice audits internally. He had asked Diane to find every gap she could find, and they had closed every one she identified. But preparation and execution were different things, and by mid-morning of the first day, Ethan knew there was a problem. One of Carol's engineers, a quiet, precise man named Garrett, had been spending time with the corrective action documentation and had identified an inconsistency in how non-conformances had been logged during a specific 3-week window 8 months ago. The logging wasn't wrong exactly, but it didn't fully trace the root cause analysis the way the procedure required. Ethan saw Diane's face when Garrett flagged it. She knew. He stepped in before she could speak. "That's a documentation gap on our part," he said directly to Carol. "The root cause work was done. Marcus and Diane both worked through it, and the corrective action was implemented and effective. But the documentation trail doesn't fully show the process. That's my responsibility. I should have caught it in our internal review." Carol looked at him. Her engineers looked at him. "What's the corrective action documentation showing?" she asked. "It shows the conclusion, but not the full analysis path. I can walk you through the actual analysis now, and we'll update the procedure to require the full documentation trail going forward." Carol was quiet for a moment. "Walk me through it." He walked her through it. Marcus came in partway and added the technical detail Ethan didn't have. It took 40 minutes. When they finished, Carol made a note in her file. They continued the audit. By the end of day 2, Garrett had found 2 additional minor observations: process documentation that needed clarification, a calibration record with incomplete traceability. Both were real. Both were addressed directly. At the closeout meeting, Carol looked at her notes and then looked at Ethan. 3 observations, she said, all minor, all addressed or committed for resolution with a timeline. She paused. Audit result is conditional pass. You have 30 days to close the documentation items. When they're closed, I'll update the approval to full. Ethan said, "Understood. Thank you." After Carol and her team left, Diane sat down heavily in a folding chair and put her face in her hands for about 5 seconds. Then she looked up. "I should have caught the corrective action documentation thing," she said. "We both should have," Ethan said. "That's why it's a team. I feel terrible about it. Feel terrible about it for the rest of today, and then fix it tomorrow. Both of those things matter." She looked at him. "You didn't throw me under the bus in there. You didn't make a mistake to be thrown under the bus for. You made an oversight. There's a difference." He picked up his jacket. "Write the corrective action procedure update tonight and send it to me. I want to review it before it goes to Carol." She had it in his inbox by 9 that night. It was thorough and clear. He sent it to Carol with his approval the following morning. The full audit approval came back in 22 days. What? Year 3 arrived without announcement and settled in like a different season. Not warmer exactly, but more certain. The company had found its footing in a way that felt less provisional than before. Holloway Precision Works now ran 2 shifts most weeks. The headcount had grown to 14, 7 on the floor, 4 in support and quality roles. 2 people Ethan had hired specifically to handle the supply chain and client coordination work that had been splitting Tommy's attention for over a year. Tommy had finally, in the 3rd year, accepted the title of Operations Manager. He had resisted it for a long time on the grounds that titles were less important than work. Ethan had told him the title came with a salary adjustment, and Tommy had said, "That's different," and accepted. The clients had diversified in ways that mattered. Novamed remained the anchor relationship. Sandra Leith had expanded the supply agreement twice, and the certification gap that had been a discussion point in year 1 was long closed. Trident had become a steady quarterly client whose orders were predictable enough to plan capacity around. Arbor Precision, after the full audit approval, had tripled their initial order volume. Jim Caulfield's Rescue Equipment Company had added 2 new product lines, both requiring the precision work that larger suppliers couldn't be bothered with. And there were newer clients, a robotics manufacturer whose prototype tolerances had impressed even Marcus, a defense-adjacent instrumentation company that had found them through a referral from Carol Vance, a university research lab that needed custom tooling for a materials testing project, and had no idea how to source it until their lead engineer made a phone call to a contact who knew a contact who knew Ethan Holloway. Word had moved through the industry in the lateral, undirected way that reputation travels. Nobody had written a story about Holloway Precision Works. Nobody had put them on a list. They had simply done the work well and honestly and consistently, and the people who needed that work had found them. The building had changed too. The roof was solid now. The electrical system had been upgraded. The floor had been properly marked and organized in the way that Marcus had wanted from the beginning, but that they hadn't had the resources to execute for over a year. New lighting, a dedicated quality inspection room that Diane had designed herself with enough input from the team that even Ray, who had opinions about the placement of every piece of equipment, had declared it acceptable. One afternoon in the middle of the 3rd year, Ethan walked the floor the way he did sometimes, not looking for problems, just looking, and noticed Phil working at one of the lathes, running a component for the Arbor order with the patient, unhurried precision of a man who has been doing something long enough that the motion is in his hands before his brain has finished deciding. Phil was 59 now. He had mentioned his retirement calculations twice in 3 years, both times in the context of the company's equity valuation, which had grown to something that made the numbers he'd originally accepted look like a discount. Phil had not mentioned leaving. Ethan watched him work for a moment, and Phil looked up and caught him. "You checking on me?" Phil said. "I'm just walking the floor." "Sure." Phil turned back to the machine. "Everything looks fine on this end." "I know," Ethan said. He continued walking, past the VMC where Marcus was setting up a run, talking to one of the newer machinists, a 24-year-old named Kenji, who had come to them through a vocational program and who Marcus had taken under his guidance with the particular investment of someone passing something forward. Past the quality room where Diane was reviewing documentation at her desk. Past the supply chain office where Tommy was on the phone, voice low, working through a delivery timeline with someone on the other side who apparently didn't understand why lead times worked the way they did. The news about Delmark had been getting worse. The consulting model had failed more completely than anyone had publicly stated yet. The board had voted out 2 members. Victoria had reportedly pushed through one more restructuring attempt, a pivot back toward a manufacturing model using contract facilities, which the board had funded reluctantly and which had produced results that satisfied nobody. The investor who had reduced his position in year 2 had sold the remainder. 2 others had followed. The company's debt service was not sustainable at current revenue. Everyone who followed the industry closely knew it. The question was not whether a sale was coming, but when and to whom. Ethan had been quiet about this inside the company. He didn't know yet what he thought. He knew what Tommy had said, that the main Delmark plant was bigger, better equipped, capable of volumes that Holloway Precision Works could not currently approach. He knew what that would mean for the 160 people still employed there under the remaining operations Victoria had pieced together from what was left. He also knew what had happened in that boardroom 3 years ago. He was not under any illusions about the emotional reality of walking back into the building where he had been publicly dismissed and called irrelevant by someone who had never spent a day working at his level. He was human. He had not resolved that completely, regardless of what he might say if asked directly. But he kept coming back to the same calculation, the same question he always came back to when emotion tried to run ahead of sense. What does this actually make possible, and for whom? He went back to his office and opened the financial model he'd been building quietly for the past 3 months. The one that showed what the combination of Holloway Precision Works and the Delmark facility would look like. The capacity, the workforce, the client base, the market position. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Gerald Fitch. Gerald answered on the third ring with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had seen enough to know that urgency was usually someone else's problem. "Ethan Holloway," Gerald said. "I wondered when you'd call. You've been expecting this? I've been watching your company grow for 3 years, and I've been watching the other situation develop." A pause. "You've built something real, Ethan. I had good people." "You did. But you also had the vision, which is the thing you tried to show us in that room, and we didn't listen." Gerald's voice was even, but something in it carried weight. "I've thought about that meeting a lot." "I need to understand the acquisition landscape," Ethan said. "What the board's appetite is. What the process looks like. Whether a direct approach is viable." "It's viable," Gerald said. "The board wants this resolved cleanly. They're tired." A pause. "Are you serious about this?" Ethan looked at the financial model on his screen. He thought about the people still working at Delmark, reduced in number but real, still showing up every day to a company that no longer knew what it was. He thought about the machines in the main plant, older now, some of them, but capable. He thought about what those machines could do in the hands of people who understood precision work. He thought about carrying a cardboard box out of a building where he had given 11 years of his life, and his daughter sitting on the curb and saying, "We're going to be okay," without knowing whether it was true. "Yes," he said, "I'm serious." Gerald Fitch did not move quickly, but he moved with purpose, which Ethan had learned over the course of 3 phone calls was more valuable than speed in a situation like this. The first call had been the exploratory one, what the board's position was, what the realistic valuation range looked like, whether there was appetite for a direct acquisition approach versus a competitive auction process. Gerald had answered each question with the measured precision of someone who had been involved in enough transactions to know which details mattered and which ones were noise. The board was fractured, he said. Not hostile, but fractured. Different members had different priorities, different thresholds for what a sale needed to accomplish. The investors who had already exited wanted the remaining stakeholders made whole. The ones still in wanted the best number they could get. Nobody was particularly attached to the company's future as a going concern. They wanted out cleanly. "What about Victoria?" Ethan had asked. "Her employment contract ends with a change of control," Gerald said. "She has no vote in the sale process. She's aware the company is being sold. Beyond that, I don't know what her plans are." Ethan had absorbed this without comment. The second call had brought in Ethan's lawyer and a financial advisor named Ruth Campos, whom Ruth had come recommended through a contact in Ethan's industry network, a compact, skeptical woman in her 50s who had reviewed the financial model Ethan had been building for 3 months and said with the directness he would come to appreciate, "This is a reasonable framework, and you've underestimated your integration costs by about 20%. He had gone back and revised the model. The third call had been the hardest. Not because the business discussion was difficult, but because it was the call where Ethan had to present his financing structure, which required explaining that he was proposing to acquire a company several times the size of his current operation using a combination of his own equity, a term loan from a regional bank that had been watching Holloway Precision Works for 2 years and had agreed in principle to the debt facility, and a structured seller financing arrangement that Ruth had designed to bridge the gap between what the bank would lend and what the deal required. It was a real number. It was a serious commitment. It was the kind of financial exposure that, if the integration went wrong, would not just end the company, it would end everything he had built, and likely the house he still lived in, and Nora's school stability, and the livelihoods of 14 people who had bet on him. He had not hidden any of this from himself. Ruth had made sure of that in a conversation that she had opened by saying, "I need you to understand the downside scenario completely before we go further," and then walking him through it in specific, unsentimental terms. He had listened to all of it. "Do you want to proceed?" Ruth had asked when she finished. "Yes," he said. "Why?" It was a good question. He had thought about it seriously before answering. "Because the Delmark facility has capabilities we can't replicate without capital expenditure we couldn't fund for years. Because there are still skilled people in that building who know how to do things that are disappearing from domestic manufacturing. Because the combined entity can serve clients that neither company can serve alone." He paused. "And because the alternative is watching something worth saving get broken up and sold for parts." Ruth had looked at him over her reading glasses. "That last reason is the one that'll get you in trouble if you let it run the decision." "I know," he said. "That's why I listed it last." She had smiled, briefly, and gone back to the term sheet. Thus, the formal offer was submitted on a Thursday morning in late autumn. Ethan signed the documents at Ruth's office, his lawyer beside him, going through each page with the focused attention of someone who understood that every line meant something, and that inattention at this stage was expensive. He signed his name 14 times. He initialed 23 pages. When it was done, Ruth sent the package to the board's legal representative and said, "Now we wait." They waited 11 days. The counterproposal that came back was within a range that Ruth described as workable, which in her vocabulary meant there was a negotiation to be had. 3 more rounds of back and forth over 2 weeks, each one narrowing the gap between positions, each one requiring Ethan to sit with his team and go through the numbers again and decide what was real and what was posturing. Tommy had been told, Marcus had been told. He had gathered the full team on a Sunday afternoon and explained what was happening. The potential acquisition, what it would mean for Holloway Precision Works, what it would mean for the people at Delmark if the deal went through. He had answered questions for an hour. Ray had asked, "Does this change our equity positions?" "No, the deal structure protects your positions. You'll see the documentation." "When?" "This week." Phil had asked, "What happens to the people still at Delmark if someone else buys it?" "I don't know," Ethan said. "I know what happens if we buy it." "What happens?" "We put the manufacturing operation back together. We hire back as many of the skilled workers as we can find who are still available. We run it the way we know how to run things." He looked around the room. "Same way we've been running this." The room was quiet for a moment. Marcus said, "When do you know if it goes through?" "A few more weeks," Ethan said. "Maybe less." It was less. The final agreement was reached on a Tuesday evening, the number landing within a range that Ruth had told him 3 weeks ago was the realistic outcome if both sides negotiated in good faith. Ethan was at his kitchen table when Ruth called. Nora was doing homework across from him. She was 10 now, in 5th grade, with a social studies project spread across half the table and a focused expression that she had, definitively, inherited from her mother. "We have a deal," Ruth said. "Board voted this evening, 6-1. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Gerald?" he said. "Gerald voted yes," Ruth said. "He was the one who moved it to the final vote." "Who voted no?" "Doesn't matter," Ruth said. 6-1 is a majority. Closing is in 3 weeks, pending documentation. Congratulations, Ethan. He set the phone down on the table. Nora looked up from her project. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of reading a room. "Good news?" she said. "Yeah," he said. Good news." "What kind?" He looked at his daughter, 10 years old, homework spread around her, the same serious attention she had brought to everything since she was old enough to pay attention to things. "You remember when I lost my job?" he said. "When you were 7 and you were waiting at the gate with your backpack." She made a face that said she remembered, and also that she didn't love being reminded of things from when she was little. "Yeah. The company that fired me, I'm going to buy it." She processed this. "Buy the whole company?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "Is that a good idea?" He laughed. A real one, sudden and unguarded. "I think so," he said. "I'm pretty sure." She looked at him with the skeptical appraisal of a fifth grader who has spent enough time around adults to know that pretty sure and definitely are different things. "Okay," she said finally, and went back to her social studies project. The closing happened on a Wednesday morning in December, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in the city, the kind of neutral territory that deal closings occupy. Not Ethan's space, not the Delmark board space, just a room with a long table and water glasses and a view of the winter skyline that nobody was paying attention to. Ruth was there. His lawyer was there. The board's legal team occupied the other side of the table. 2 board members attended in person. Gerald was one of them. The other was a man named Howard Briggs, whom Ethan had met once during the negotiation process and who had the air of someone who would rather be somewhere else and intended to be shortly. The documentation review took 2 hours. There was one moment of friction, a indemnification clause that the board's lawyers had adjusted in the final version, a change that Ethan's lawyer caught and flagged, and that required 30 minutes of discussion before it was resolved in a form both sides accepted. Not dramatic, not hostile. Just the friction of real transactions involving real money and real risk. Then the signing began. It was less ceremonial than people who haven't been through a closing might expect. Documents moved around the table. People signed where indicated. Notarized copies were made. The escrow instructions were confirmed. Ethan signed his name over and over on pages that had been reviewed and negotiated and revised and reviewed again, and with each signature, something that had been hypothetical became real. The debt obligation, the ownership transfer, the responsibility for a workforce and a facility and a set of client relationships that he had not built, but was now, as of each successive signature, responsible for. When the final document was executed, Ruth said quietly, "That's it." Gerald stood up and came around the table with the unhurried deliberateness of a man in his 70s who has learned that moments deserve to be occupied fully. He extended his hand. "Well done," he said, and meant it in a way that was not about the transaction. Ethan shook it. "Thank you. For what you did in there, 3 years ago. For trying." Gerald looked at him steadily. "I didn't do enough." "You did what you could." "It should have been more." Gerald held his gaze for a moment. "Make something good out of it." Howard Briggs shook hands efficiently and left. The lawyers began the process of organizing documents. Ruth was on her phone, handling something that needed handling. The room began its transition from an event back into a space. Ethan stood at the window and looked out at the city. The sky was low and gray, a winter sky with the flat quality of a day that doesn't intend to change its mind about the weather. Below, the streets moved with the ordinary traffic of a Wednesday morning. People who had no idea what had just happened in a conference room on the 14th floor, people going about the specific and particular work of their own lives. He was 35 years old. He owned a manufacturing company he had built from a leaky building and 6 people who had believed in him. He now also owned the company that had fired him, mortgaged to the ceiling, responsible for whatever came next. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the weight of it, the particular vertiginous weight of having arrived at the thing you worked toward, and finding that arrival is not an ending, but the beginning of the harder work. He also felt something else underneath the weight. Something steady. Ruth appeared at his elbow. "Car's ready downstairs." "1 more minute," he said. She gave him his minute, and he used it to look at the skyline and think about the people he was now responsible for, his own team at Holloway Precision who had been with him from the beginning or close enough to it. And the people at Delmark, reduced in number but real, still showing up. He thought about what he needed to do in the next 30 days to keep that from falling apart, while he figured out how to put it back together. Then he picked up his briefcase and followed Ruth to the elevator. He drove to the Delmark plant that afternoon. He hadn't planned to go that day. There were things to handle, calls to make, the integration planning that Ruth and Tommy had been building for weeks that now needed to begin in earnest. But he found himself driving toward the plant with the specific, unplanned quality of something that needed to be done before it could be deferred any further. He had been here hundreds of times, thousands of times, in 11 years. The gate, the parking lot, the entrance with the old sticker on the glass door. The sticker had been replaced at some point, a newer version, Cleaner, same words. Delmark Manufacturing, ST, 1981. He went inside. The lobby was quieter than he remembered. The safety bulletin board was still there, different papers pinned to it now. The floor had been refinished at some point, though it was scuffed again. The front desk receptionist, not anyone he recognized, looked up when he came in. "I'm Ethan Holloway," he said. "The closing was this morning. I'm the new owner." She blinked. "Oh," she said. Let me call someone." The someone she called was the plant manager, a man named Derek Osei, who had been brought in by Victoria about 18 months ago to oversee the reduced manufacturing operation she'd tried to maintain. Derek was in his mid-40s, competent seeming, with the careful expression of someone who has been managing uncertainty long enough to have gotten professional about it. They shook hands in the lobby. "I know this is a strange day," Ethan said. "I'm not here to make announcements or do anything official today. I just wanted to walk the floor." Derek looked at him with the particular assessment of a man deciding how much to trust someone he's just met who has just become his employer. "Of course," he said. They walked the floor together. It was both familiar and not. The layout was the same. Ethan had the floor plan so thoroughly in his head from years of working it that he could have walked it in the dark. But the feel was different. The machines that were still running were being used, but not at the density he remembered. Sections of the floor that had once been active were quiet, the equipment standing idle with the particular stillness of things that used to do work and don't anymore. The workforce was maybe 120 people on the floor, down from over 300. Some faces he recognized. Most he didn't, or didn't recognize immediately. 3 years was long enough that some things had changed. One face he recognized immediately was Carla Singh, who had been a floor supervisor under him for 4 years and had a quality of attention during a production run that Ethan had always considered one of the best he'd worked with. She was supervising a milling operation near the north end of the floor. She looked up when he passed. He stopped. "Carla," he said. She looked at him, a long, direct look that he couldn't fully read. Then she said, "I heard it was you." "Word travels." "In this building it does." She glanced at the machine running beside her, checked something, looked back. "You here to fire everyone or hire everyone back?" "Neither today," he said. "I'm here to walk the floor." She held his gaze for a moment. "Same as always," she said, and turned back to her machine. He kept walking. Derek stayed beside him and answered questions. Current client load, equipment status, workforce breakdown. The maintenance deferred items that had accumulated over 3 years of reduced operation and tighter budgets. It was a list that was longer than Ethan would have liked and shorter than he had feared. At the far end of the floor, near the backloading area, he stopped. This was where he had spent a lot of time in his last years at Delmark. The area closest to the older precision equipment, the machines that had always required the most attention, and that he had argued, in the proposal that got him fired, were the core of what the company could still become. Some of those machines were still here. Not all of them. A few had been sold during the liquidation process, gone to auction or to buyers he didn't know. But several remained, standing in the same positions he remembered, looking worn and a little neglected but present. He put his hand on the housing of an older horizontal boring mill that he had personally kept running for the better part of 2 years with a combination of sourced parts and the specific knowledge of its mechanical personality that came from a long working relationship. Derek watched him. "You know these machines," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Ethan said. He stayed for another hour. He talked to 3 more floor workers, brief exchanges, not speeches, just acknowledgement. He asked Derek for the full maintenance log before he left. Derek had it on his desk and handed it over without hesitation, which Ethan noted as a good sign about Derek's character. Outside, in the parking lot, he sat in his truck for a moment. He had expected to feel something more specific here, satisfaction or closure or some narrative emotion that matched the size of what had happened. What he felt instead was more granular and less resolved, the weight of the work ahead, the specific faces of the people inside that building, the list of deferred maintenance in the folder on the passenger seat. He also felt, underneath all of that, something that was not satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Not the satisfaction of having defeated something, more like the satisfaction of having found the right place to put what he had built. He started the truck and drove back to Holloway Precision. The conversation with Victoria happened 4 days later. He had not sought it. She had reached out through an intermediary, her lawyer contacting his lawyer, to request a meeting before she transitioned out under the change of control terms. He had thought about it for a day and then said yes. They met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, 8 in the morning on a Friday. She was already there when he arrived, sitting with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, looking out the window with an expression he couldn't characterize. She looked tired, not defeated. Victoria Ashford was not someone who wore defeat openly, but tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for longer than they expected to. He sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The coffee shop moved around them, other conversations, the sound of the espresso machine, the ordinary morning traffic of a place where people stopped briefly on their way to somewhere else. "You don't have to do this," she said first. "I know," he said. "I thought it was the right thing." She looked at him directly, the same direct way she had always looked at people. The quality that had read as confidence in the boardroom 3 years ago and read now as something more complicated. "I underestimated you," she said. "I want to say that clearly, not as a formality. I assessed you incorrectly, and I made a decision based on that assessment, and it was the wrong decision." He looked at her. He had thought about this conversation in various forms over 3 years, in the moments when he let himself think about it. He had imagined versions where he said things that were cutting or pointed or satisfying in the way that vindication is theoretically satisfying. He had also imagined versions where he was magnanimous in ways that felt performative. What he actually felt, sitting across from her in a coffee shop on a Friday morning, was more ordinary than either of those. She was a person who had made a mistake that had cost a lot of people a lot of things, including herself. He was a person who had spent 3 years building an answer to that mistake. Neither of those facts canceled the other. "I know you believed in the plan," he said. "I know you thought you were doing the right thing." "I thought I was being strategic," she said. "I thought manufacturing was the problem and consulting was the solution. I had models that supported it. I had a track record that I thought translated." She looked at her coffee cup. "I didn't understand what I was walking into. The people in that plant, what they knew, what they'd built over decades, I didn't have a framework for valuing it, so I didn't value it." "And what you called a white paper," Ethan said. "Not with heat, just as a fact." She absorbed it. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" She shook her head slightly. "I don't know yet. I have conversations scheduled. I have options." She paused. "Different kind of work, I think. More careful work." "That's probably right." She looked up. "Is this the part where you tell me I deserved what happened?" "No," he said. "This is the part where I drink my coffee and you drink yours and we both get back to what we're doing." A pause. "That's it?" she said. "That's it," he said. "I never wanted you to fail, Victoria. I didn't spend 3 years hoping for this. I spent 3 years building something. The rest of it," he gestured, a small motion that indicated everything outside this conversation, "I don't have much use for." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, some tension releasing, some weight shifting. "You're going to make it work," she said. "The combined company, you know that." "I think so," he said. "I have good people." "You do," she said. "You always did." He finished his coffee. He left first, shaking her hand at the door. A brief, businesslike handshake, no different from the kind that happens at the end of a professional meeting between two people who are closing a chapter and moving on. He walked to his truck. Behind him, through the window, he could see her still sitting at the table, looking out at the street. He drove back to the plant, his plant now, both of them, the small one they had built from nothing and the larger one they had just taken on, with the integration plan on the seat beside him and a full day's work waiting. The coffee had been decent. The conversation had been what it needed to be. He pulled into the parking lot at Holloway Precision and went inside. Tommy was at his desk with the integration timeline spread in front of him, red pen in hand, making notes. He looked up when Ethan came in. "How'd it go?" he said. "Fine," Ethan said. Where are we on the equipment assessment for the main plant? Tommy turned the timeline around so Ethan could see it. Marcus wants 3 days on site before he'll commit to a rehabilitation sequence. I told him he had 2. Give him 3, Ethan said. Tommy made a note. The workforce outreach list is ready. Carla Singh, she's on it. I have 22 other former Delmark employees who left in the first round of layoffs who are still in the region and still in the trade. Start making calls Monday, Ethan said. Already drafted the outreach message. You want to review it? Send it to me tonight. Done. Tommy looked at him. You okay? Ethan sat down. He looked at the room, the familiar organized disorder of a working office, the sounds of the shop floor coming through the wall, the particular quality of a place where real work was being done by people who understood why it mattered. Yeah, he said, I'm okay. He meant it. The integration was not clean. Nobody who had ever merged 2 companies had expected it to be clean, and Ethan had gone in with his eyes open, but there is a difference between anticipating difficulty in the abstract and standing in the middle of it at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in January, when 3 things are broken simultaneously and 2 of your key people are not speaking to each other. The 2 people not speaking to each other were Marcus and Derek Osei. It had started, as most workplace friction does, over something specific that was actually about something larger. Marcus had walked through the main plant floor in his 3 days of assessment and had produced a rehabilitation sequence that was thorough, technically sound, and completely reorganized the production priorities that Derek had spent the previous year carefully constructing. He had presented it to Ethan without consulting Derek first. Derek had found out about it when Tommy circulated the document for feedback. Derek had come to Ethan's office, the one at the main plant now, a larger space than the back office folding table he'd been working from for 3 years, which he had not yet fully settled into, and said, with the controlled precision of a man who is angry but professional, Your machinist handed me a document that reorganizes my entire production floor without speaking to me once. Ethan said, I know, that was wrong. I should have structured that introduction differently. Derek looked at him. He had expected either defensiveness or excessive apology, and getting neither seemed to require a moment of recalibration. I've been running this floor for 1.5 years, he said. I know what's here. I know what these machines can do and what they can't. Whoever Marcus Webb is, he doesn't know this equipment the way I do. He knows precision machining the way almost nobody in this region does, Ethan said. And you know this facility and this workforce. I need both of those things to be true at the same time. He looked at Derek steadily. But I handled the introduction badly, and I'm fixing that now. Can you give me an hour this afternoon with you and Marcus together? Derek said yes, without warmth, which was enough. That afternoon meeting lasted 2.5 hours and was uncomfortable for most of it. Marcus did not apologize easily. He was constitutionally unsuited to it. But he did, when Ethan pressed him directly and privately before the meeting, acknowledged that presenting the document without prior conversation had been dismissive of Derek's knowledge. He acknowledged this to Derek's face in the meeting with the particular economy of a man saying exactly what needs to be said and not one word more. Derek received it. Then he pulled out his own documentation, maintenance records, workforce capability assessments, client load data, and spread it on the table. Here's what I have, Derek said. If you want to tell me what your sequence misses, I'll listen. Marcus looked at the documentation. He picked up Derek's maintenance records and read through them with the focused attention he gave to things that deserved it. After a few minutes, he set them down and said, Your bearing replacement intervals on the horizontal mills are shorter than I'd run them. That tells me you've been seeing vibration signatures. Yes, Derek said. Started about 8 months ago on the number 3 unit. I want to see it run. Tomorrow morning, Derek said. They went together the next morning without Ethan. He found out later from Tommy that they had spent 4 hours on the floor, during which Marcus had identified what he believed was the root cause of the vibration issue, and Derek had shown him something about the workflow sequencing that Marcus had not accounted for in his rehabilitation plan. When they came back, Marcus found Ethan in the office. Revision to the rehabilitation sequence, he said, and handed him 3 handwritten pages. How significant a revision? Significant enough, Marcus said. Derek knows his floor. That was from Marcus Webb, approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. Ethan filed the pages and didn't make a thing of it. The larger integration moved forward through January and February with the grinding, unglamorous work of two organizations learning to function as one. Systems that didn't talk to each other, processes that contradicted each other, cultural differences between the Holloway Precision team, tight, informal, built on years of shared difficulty, and the Delmark remnant workforce, who had spent 3 years watching their company fail in slow motion and carried the specific wariness of people who had been through a bad period and weren't sure the new thing was different. Ethan addressed that directly. He held floor meetings, not speeches, just conversations, small groups, open questions. He answered everything he could answer honestly and said clearly when he didn't know. He found, in those conversations, things he hadn't expected. Workers who had stayed through the bad years not because they had no options, but because they had felt responsible for each other, because leaving felt like abandonment of people they had worked beside for a decade. Workers who had watched the consulting strategy fail in real time and had kept showing up anyway because the alternative was giving up on something they had built their working lives around. There was a woman named Grace Tillman, a quality inspector in her late 40s who had been at Delmark for 16 years. She had come through every round of cuts, not because she was indispensable in a technical sense, though she was good, but because she had refused to leave. She had watched the plant reduce from 300 people to 120, had watched product lines shut down and equipment go to auction, and had kept coming in every morning. Ethan talked to her during one of the floor meetings, in a small group near the inspection area. He asked, not rhetorically, genuinely, why she had stayed. Grace considered the question seriously, the way people do when they're deciding whether to give the real answer or the safe one. "My mother worked here," she said. 21 years, retired in 2009. My uncle worked here before that. I grew up knowing what this place was. She looked at the floor around them. When it started going bad, I kept thinking it would turn, that somebody would figure it out. She paused. Nobody did. Until now, Ethan said. She looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had been given reasons to be hopeful before and had learned to check them carefully. Ask me again in a year, she said. He respected that answer more than any easier one would have deserved. The workforce rebuilding happened in stages that were more complicated than the clean version of the story would suggest. Tommy had called every name on his list, the 22 former Delmark workers still in the region, still in the trade. Of those 22, 14 had responded. Of those 14, 9 had come in for conversations. Of those 9, 6 had accepted positions. 6 people out of a list of 22 was not the triumphant mass return that the narrative would have liked. Some had found other work and built new stability they weren't willing to disrupt. Some had left the trade entirely. One had moved away. One, a man Ethan remembered as one of the best press operators on the floor, had come in, sat across from Ethan, and said with no bitterness but complete honesty, I appreciate what you're doing here, but I watched this place burn me once. I can't do it again. Ethan had said he understood. He had meant it. The 6 who came back brought something that couldn't be replicated by hiring new workers at equivalent skill levels. They brought the specific accumulated knowledge of this facility, these machines, these quirks and rhythms that only time and attention could build. Carla Singh came back, and within 2 weeks was running a floor section with the same focused competence Ethan remembered. A press operator named Ben Farrow came back and spent his first week reacquainting himself with a machine he had run for 9 years, talking to it under his breath the way experienced operators do when they're listening as much as working. By the end of February, the combined workforce was 63 people across both facilities, not 340, not what it had been at its peak, but 63 people doing work they understood, in a place that was beginning, in the halting and imperfect way of real things, to cohere. The finances were tight in a way that required Ethan's constant attention. The debt service on the acquisition loan was substantial and unforgiving. 2 of the Delmark-era clients had not survived the transition. One had already moved to an overseas supplier before the acquisition closed, and another had waited to see how the change of control went, and then decided the uncertainty wasn't worth it. Losing those accounts had created a gap that Ruth had flagged as the primary financial risk in the first 6 months. Ethan had been working that gap since before the closing. Sandra Leith at Novamed had expanded the supply agreement to include components that could now be run at the main plant with its larger equipment. Peter Haas at Trident had referred them to two other companies in his network. Carol Vance at Arbor had personally called the head of procurement at a sister company and described Holloway Precision's quality record in terms that led directly to a meeting, then a proposal, then a contract. These things did not happen because Ethan had schemed to make them happen. They happened because he had spent 3 years operating in a way that made people willing to pick up the phone and say good things when someone asked. That was the lesson he kept coming back to, in the difficult months of integration when it would have been easy to focus on the size of what still needed to be done. The work that looked purely transactional, the 40-unit Novamed order, the Trident prototypes, the audit with Carol Vance, had never been purely transactional. Every honest answer, every proactive phone call about a problem before the client had to call about it, every time he had said, "I don't know, but I'll find out," instead of guessing, had been building something that wasn't in any financial model. A record, a reputation, a reason for people to trust that the next thing would be handled the same way. You couldn't accelerate it. You couldn't manufacture it. You just had to do the work right for long enough. The apprenticeship program was Tommy's idea, technically, though it grew out of conversations that had been happening in different forms for most of the third year. The conversation had started with Marcus, as a lot of important conversations at the company did. He had been working with Kenji, the 24-year-old who had come through the vocational program, for the better part of a year, and he had said to Ethan during one of their end-of-day conversations in the shop, "There's nobody coming up behind us." Ethan had looked at him. "In this trade," Marcus said, "the schools aren't producing machinists the way they used to. The ones who do come out don't have practical knowledge. They know the textbook and they don't know the machine." He paused. "Kenji is good. He's going to be very good. But I'm 53 years old and Dale is 52 and Phil is 59. In 10 years, if we don't build something, we lose everything we know." Tommy had been in the room and had said, "What if we built the something?" The program they put together was not complicated in concept, though it was in execution. They partnered with 2 vocational schools in the region, the same kind of program Ethan had come through himself, a fact he did not overlook, to identify students who showed aptitude for precision work. They offered paid apprenticeships, 2 years of structured on-the-job training alongside experienced machinists, working on real production runs with real accountability, learning not just technique, but the underlying principles that made technique transferable. The funding came partly from the company and partly from a workforce development grant that Tommy had found and applied for with a thoroughness that had impressed even Ruth, who reviewed the application and said it was the best organized grant proposal she had seen from a company at their stage. The first cohort was 4 people. 2 came from the vocational program. One was referred by Grace Tillman, her nephew, a 20-year-old named Antoine, who had been working construction and who Grace had apparently been quietly recruiting for months. And one was a woman named Sarah Park, who had an engineering degree and no manufacturing experience, and who had found the program posting herself and sent an application that was, by everyone's assessment, the most prepared of the 4. Marcus ran the technical training with Kenji as a junior mentor. Dale handled the fixturing and setup curriculum. Grace, to Ethan's quiet satisfaction, agreed to lead the quality inspection training after he asked her directly, and she thought about it for 2 days before saying yes. The 4 apprentices started on a Monday in March, 7 months after the acquisition closed. They were shown the floor. They were introduced to the machines. Marcus gave them a talk that was characteristically direct, not a welcome speech, more like a briefing on the standards of the work and why those standards existed. "Every part that leaves this floor," Marcus told them, "goes somewhere that matters. Medical equipment, safety systems, tools that other people use to build other things. You are not making products. You are making precision. That means when you make a mistake, and you will make mistakes, you catch it before it ships. You don't hide it. You don't hope it passes inspection. You catch it, and you fix it, and you document it so we understand why it happened." He looked at them. "Any questions?" Antoine raised his hand. "What happens if we don't catch it?" "Then we catch it in inspection," Marcus said, "and we have a different conversation." Antoine nodded. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where you learn something you don't forget." That was the beginning. Okay. The first real test of the combined operation came in April, 5 months after closing, and it came from the direction Ethan had been watching but hadn't expected to arrive so soon. Arbor Precision Systems, Carol Vance's company, the defense-adjacent instrumentation client, reached out with a request that went beyond anything in their existing supply agreement. They had a program requirement, a run of 600 precision-machined housings for a sensor assembly, tolerances at the edge of what their previous suppliers had ever managed, delivery in 16 weeks. The program was time-sensitive. The client above Arbor in the supply chain had a contractual deadline that had no flexibility. Carol called Ethan directly. "I'm going to tell you up front that this is a stretch ask," she said. "The volume is higher than anything you've run for us. The tolerances on the inner bore profile are tighter than the Arbor standard, and 16 weeks is aggressive." "Tell me the full spec," Ethan said. She sent it that afternoon. Ethan took it to Marcus and Derek together, deliberately together, the way he had been doing things since the integration began. Because the dynamic between them had evolved over 3 months into something that was not warm friendship, but was genuine mutual respect, which in a working context was more durable anyway. Marcus read the spec. Derek read the spec. They were quiet for a moment. "The bore tolerance is achievable on the VMC if we optimize the toolpath," Marcus said. "But I want to run test pieces before I commit." "How many test pieces before you're confident?" Ethan asked. 10, Marcus said. "We'd need to split the run between both facilities," Derek said. "The volume won't work with just the VMC. We'd need the main plant's horizontal machining center running in parallel." Marcus looked at Derek. Derek looked at Marcus. "Can your horizontal hold these tolerances?" Marcus said. "Rebuild was completed in February," Derek said. "I've been running it for 6 weeks. It'll hold." "I want to see the capability data." "I'll pull it this afternoon." Ethan looked at both of them. "Tell me in 48 hours if we can do this." They told him in 36. The answer was yes, with conditions. The test pieces needed to run clean. The toolpath optimization on the VMC needed a specific approach that Marcus had identified, and the delivery timeline required them to run both machines on extended shifts for the last 6 weeks of the program. Ethan called Carol back. "We can do it," he said. "I want to walk you through the production plan so you understand how we're approaching the tolerance requirements." "Send it to me," she said. He sent it. She reviewed it with her engineering team. She called back the next morning. "Your production plan is more detailed than what I see from most of our suppliers," she said. "How long did it take to put together?" "Marcus Webb and Derek Osai spent a day on it," Ethan said. "I reviewed it and added the quality checkpoints. Tell Marcus and Derek that it's solid work." He told them. Marcus received it with his characteristic economy, a single nod. Derek allowed himself a slight smile, which from a man who had spent 3 years managing a failing company was practically jubilation. The program ran for 16 weeks. It was not smooth, nothing that complex ever was. In the 8th week, a tooling issue on the VMC caused a deviation in 3 consecutive parts that Marcus caught at the interval check, pulled from the run, and flagged before they got anywhere near the inspection stage. The incident cost them 4 hours of production time and required a toolpath revision that Marcus and Kenji worked through together, Kenji doing the programming under Marcus's direction, both of them at the machine until 11 at night. Ethan was there too. Not because his presence was required, Marcus had it handled, but because he had never been the kind of person who went home when his people were still working a problem. At 11:30, Kenji ran the revised toolpath. The part came off the machine. Marcus measured it. He handed the caliper to Kenji. Kenji read the measurement. He looked up. "That's it." "That's it," Marcus said. "Write up the deviation report tonight. Full root cause, full corrective action." "Tonight? You want to do it tomorrow when you've half forgotten the details?" Kenji did it that night. It was the most thorough deviation report Ethan had seen from someone in their 2nd year of working. He filed it in the quality system and sent a copy to Carol Vance proactively, per their agreement about program transparency. Carol's response arrived the next morning. "This is how it should be done. Thank you." The 600 parts shipped on day 109, 7 days ahead of schedule, all within specification. Arbor's receiving inspection passed every unit. Carol called. "We have another program," she said. "Bigger. I'd like to talk next week." 6 months after that call, a year after the acquisition closed, Ethan stood in the main plant on a Thursday afternoon and did what he sometimes did when the day allowed it: walked the floor without an agenda, just looking. The space had changed, not beyond recognition. The bones were the same, the layout familiar, but the quality of it was different. The machines that had been standing idle when he first walked through were running. The floor was organized with the specific intentional order that comes when people take ownership of their space. The documentation boards that Tommy had implemented across both facilities showed current production status, quality metrics, delivery schedules, visible to everyone, updated daily, no different from what was in the management system, but present in a form that the people doing the work could see without sitting at a computer. He watched Ben Farrow running a production sequence on a press he had run for 9 years. And the relationship between that man and that machine was a real thing, not metaphor, but the actual specific knowledge that had been built over years of attention and would have been lost if Ben had not come back. He watched Antoine, 7 months into his apprenticeship, working at a lathe under Kenji's supervision. Antoine had turned out to have the quality that Marcus identified in the first month as the thing you either had or you didn't. He listened to the machine. He paid attention not just to the readout, but to the sound, the feel, the particular language of a piece of equipment telling you what it needed. Marcus had mentioned this to Ethan in one of their end-of-day conversations, which was as close to enthusiasm as Marcus expressed. He watched Sarah park at the inspection station, going through a batch of Trident components with the methodical precision of someone who understood that quality was not a checkpoint at the end of a process, but a continuous condition throughout it. Grace had trained her. Grace was at the adjacent station, reviewing documentation, and the two of them had the easy working rhythm of people who had been doing something together long enough that they didn't need to explain themselves. He kept walking. Derek was near the back of the floor reviewing a setup with one of the newer operators. A patient, specific kind of instruction that Ethan recognized as the style of someone who had learned to teach by thinking about what the student actually needed to understand, not just what they needed to do. Derek had grown in the years since the acquisition, not in ways he announced, but in the specific ways that people grow when they are given real authority and real accountability and the context to understand why both matter. He had stopped holding himself at a careful professional distance and had started, gradually and without ceremony, acting like someone who was fully in. Ethan stopped near the north end of the floor where Carla Singh was supervising an end-of-shift quality check. She looked up. "Everything good?" she said. "Just walking the floor," he said. She gave him the same look she had given him when he came back the first day. Direct, assessing, not unkind. "You do that a lot." "Always have," he said. She considered him for a moment. "It's different now," she said. Not with sentimentality, as an observation. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She went back to her checklist. He kept walking. On a Friday evening in October, Ethan drove to Nora's school for a parent-teacher conference that he had, for the first time in 3 years, not had to reschedule. She was in 6th grade now. Her teacher was a man in his 30s named Mr. Calloway, who had the organized energy of someone who genuinely liked what he did and had thought carefully about how to do it. He sat across from Ethan in a classroom that smelled like whiteboard markers and showed him Nora's work with the specific kind of pride a teacher shows when a student has exceeded what was asked. "She's exceptional," Mr. Calloway said. "Not just academically, her thinking, the way she approaches problems. She doesn't look for the easy answer. She looks for the right one, and she'll work through something until she gets there." Ethan looked at the project spread on the desk, a research paper on structural engineering, with diagrams that were more detailed than anything he would have expected from a 6th grader. She had cited sources. She had included a section on common structural failures and what engineers had learned from them. "She told me her dad builds things," Mr. Calloway said, "that she used to watch him read engineering manuals when she was little." Ethan looked at the paper. "She's been interested in bridges since she was 7, he said. She checked out the same library book 3 times. Mr. Calloway smiled. "It shows." He drove home with that sitting in him, not pride exactly, or not just pride, something more complicated and more complete. He thought about a 7-year-old on a curb with a granola bar and a backpack, asking if they were going to be okay. He thought about the decade of evenings she had spent at the kitchen table doing homework, while he worked across from her, both of them in their own concentration, the ordinary closeness of two people living the same life. She had watched him build something. She had understood more of it than he had given her credit for, because children absorb what's around them, and Nora had been absorbing her whole life what it looked like to do hard work honestly and keep going when it didn't work and try again differently and not let the difficulty become the story. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment. He thought about the board meeting 3 years ago, about standing up in a room where nobody was listening and saying what he believed anyway, and the way it had felt to carry a box out of a building that had been his professional life for 11 years. He thought about Marcus in his garage agreeing to bet on something that hadn't yet earned $1. He thought about Tommy's handwritten log of every client interaction and Ray's truck payment and Phil's retirement calculations built on equity in a company that was 4 months old. He thought about what it actually meant to build something. It was not the dramatic version. It was not the moment of vindication or the satisfying reversal. Those moments happened, but they were not the thing. The thing was every day before them, every problem solved, and every problem deferred, and every honest conversation, and every morning when you got up and went back to the work because that was what you had decided to do. The thing was what happened between the dramatic moments and the ordinary hours, which was where most of life actually occurred. He had learned something over 3 years that he had understood intellectually before, but had not yet understood in his body, that the work itself was the answer, not the outcome, not the vindication, not the acquisition that closed on a Wednesday morning in December. The daily work, done well, done honestly, done with real attention to the people it involved, was the thing that created everything else. You could not skip to the result. You could not manufacture the reputation or the trust or the relationships that became the foundation. You had to do the work day after day and let it accumulate into something. That was not romantic. It was not inspiring in the way that stories about it tended to be inspiring. It was just true, and it was the truest thing he knew. He got out of the car and went inside. Nora was at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where so many things had happened over the years, covered in homework the way it usually was. A bowl of cereal she'd made for dinner pushed to one side because she had apparently decided cereal was acceptable for dinner, and Ethan had decided 3 years ago to pick his battles. She looked up. "How'd the conference go?" "Good," he said. "Mr. Calloway showed me the structural engineering paper." She made the face of a person who is trying to look neutral about something they care about. "Did he like it?" "He liked it a lot." The neutral face slipped briefly into something less guarded. "I spent a long time on the failure section," she said. "Most people write about what works. I thought the interesting part was what went wrong and why." He sat down across from her. "That is the interesting part." She pulled the cereal bowl back toward her and ate a spoonful, looking at her homework with the expression of someone deciding what to work on next. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "The factory, the big one. The one you bought. Is it going to be okay now?" He thought about the 63 people on the floor, the apprentices, the production schedules, the Arbor program, the debt load that was still significant but was being serviced, the conversation he'd had with Ruth the week before in which she had, for the first time, used the word stable without a qualifier. "Yeah," he said. "I think it's going to be okay." Nora nodded, with the focused consideration of a person processing information they find genuinely important. "Good," she said. "People should have places to work." He looked at his daughter, 11 years old, eating cereal at the kitchen table, writing papers about bridge failures because she found the failures more interesting than the successes. He thought about what he hoped she had learned from watching him do what he had done over the last 3 years. Not the outcome. He hoped she had learned the thing underneath the outcome. That when something needed doing, you did it. That when people were counting on you, you showed up. That honesty was not a strategy, it was a way of operating, and the only one that held up over time. That building something real, with real people, for real reasons, was its own reward in a way that nothing you could receive from the outside could replicate. He hoped she had learned that the point was never to defeat someone. It was to build something worth defending. "Want to look at the paper together?" he said. "The failure section specifically." She lit up. the genuine, unguarded enthusiasm of a kid who's been hoping someone would ask. She pulled the paper out of her folder and spread it on the table and started talking about bridge failures with the focused intensity of someone who has been thinking about this for weeks and finally has an audience who won't get bored. He listened to every word. 3 weeks later, on the first morning of a new month, Ethan arrived at the main plant before anyone else, the way he often did. He let himself in, walked through the lobby with its refinished floor and updated safety board, and went out to the factory floor. The machines were quiet in the pre-shift stillness. The organized workspace, the marked floors, the documentation boards, the inspection station where Grace would be in an hour, the VMC that Marcus would have running by 6:30, was all present and familiar, the accumulated result of what a group of people had built together over 4 years. He stood in the middle of the floor and looked around. He thought briefly about the secondary building he had first stood in 3.5 years ago. The empty space with the rusted water pipe, and the broken fluorescent lights, and the smell of old air, and the specific quality of seeing something in it that other people had not bothered to look for. He had not been special for seeing it. He had just looked. That was the thing about possibilities. They didn't announce themselves. They sat in empty buildings and old machines and people who had been told their knowledge was irrelevant, and they waited for someone to look carefully enough to see what was actually there. The door opened behind him, and Marcus came in, jacket on, carrying a travel mug of coffee. He stopped when he saw Ethan standing in the middle of the floor. "Early," Marcus said. "Habit," Ethan said. Marcus walked past him toward the VMC, the way he had walked toward it every working morning for 3.5 years, with the unhurried, purposeful step of someone going to do something they know how to do. He stopped at the machine. He set down his coffee. He ran a hand along the housing with the particular attention that had always struck Ethan as the physical expression of knowing something well, not sentimentality, just a craftsman's relationship with his instrument. "What's on the schedule today?" Ethan said. "Arbor first run for the new program. 42 parts, tight bore profile." Marcus picked up his coffee. "Should be interesting." Good interesting or bad interesting? Marcus considered this with the seriousness he gave to questions he found worth answering. "Both," he said, and started up the machine. The sound of it coming to life filled the floor, the particular mechanical voice of a precision tool finding its operating state, smooth and purposeful and ready for the day's work. Soon the others would arrive. Tommy with his clipboard and his quiet competence. Derek checking in with the floor crew before the shift started. Dale and Phil at their stations with the easy authority of people who know their machines and their limits. Carla walking her section with the focused attention she brought to everything. Kenji setting up beside Marcus, learning still, paying attention. Antoine at his lathe, listening to the sound of it the way Marcus had taught him to listen. Grace at the inspection station, reviewing the morning's first pieces with the patience of someone who had watched this place through its worst years and had chosen to stay anyway, and was still here now, doing the work. This was what it actually looked like. Not a triumph, not a vindication, a factory floor at 6:30 in the morning, people arriving to do work they were good at, in a place that was still imperfect and always would be and was real in the way that only imperfect things are real. The machines ran. The work began. Outside, the sun was coming up over Harlow Creek, with the ordinary beauty of a morning that had no idea it was supposed to be significant, just light moving across a town where people were getting up and going to work, building things, raising children, making decisions about what kind of people they intended to be. Ethan stood in the middle of the floor and listened to the machines and felt the specific quiet satisfaction of a man who had done what he said he was going to do. Not every part of it, not perfectly, not without cost, and not without people who had paid some of that cost alongside him in ways they hadn't fully agreed to when they started. But enough. Enough that when his daughter asked if things were going to be okay, he could say yes and mean it in the way that only mattered. Not the way of a man performing optimism for a child who needed reassurance, but the way of a man who had built something worth believing in, with his own hands and the hands of people he trusted, in a town he had decided was worth staying for. That was the whole of it. The rest was just the work, and the work was enough.